The cost of housing is a major issue here in Utah and across the nation, and there are many different proposals to address it. But what is the right approach that policymakers should take?
So let me start by saying Utah is in a really bad position from a housing affordability perspective.
On this episode, we sit down with a national housing expert who has a plan that could increase housing supply significantly without needing any government subsidies. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. This episode of Defending Ideas is brought to you by Clyde Companies. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking once again about the issue of housing costs here in Utah. It's a challenge that's not unique to the Beehive State. Many states across the nation and major metro areas are grappling with how to address the rising cost of housing for their residents, and that's certainly something we've faced here in Utah. We've talked about it before on this show, and it's a top focus of policymakers here in the state. And I'm very excited to bring into the conversation into the Utah dialogue on this issue, an expert at the national level. His name is Ed Pinto, and he's a senior fellow for the American Enterprise Institute, and he is also the co-director of the AEI Housing Center. Ed, welcome to Defending Ideas.
Nick, a pleasure to join you. Thank you.
Ed, I'm really excited to talk to you about this because you bring what I think is a really interesting and expert perspective that I think is going to be really valuable to policymakers here in Utah. As I mentioned, this is a top issue for us. Governor Spencer Cox has said that he's laser focused on this. This is one of, if not the top priority of his administration. And legislators have talked about this. Legislative leadership has tried to prioritize this. And survey data commissioned by Sutherland Institute in partnership with Y2 Analytics asked likely voters kind of what is top of your mind, and housing affordability was by far the top issue for likely voters in Utah, followed by things like education funding and taxes. It's kind of normal issues you would expect, but housing affordability, and even when we look across the age breakdown, family structure, political party, gender, just across the board, Utahns are concerned about housing costs. And it's something that we've all seen and felt. My wife and I, when we were buying our home in the middle of a really intense housing market here in Utah and seeing houses scooped up and prices increasing by the day, it can be stressful. It's a tough issue. So with all of that context, I want to just ask you, how do we fix it? What have you seen on the national level in your research or in other states or cities? What should we be doing here in Utah? What's your best pitch of, well, here's how we can start to actually fix the housing price issue?
Great question, Nick. So let me start with what we know, what doesn't work. What doesn't work is setting up plans and reports and things like that, particularly at the state level, asking localities to report on this or that. California's been doing that since 1969. It's called the Regional Housing Need Assessment, or RHNA. Obviously hasn't solved California's housing problem, notwithstanding it's been 60 years plus. Number two, subsidies don't work. Subsidies basically pick winners and losers, and it's by definition top down, and it tends to be one size fits all, and it gets captured by a cartel. And the cartel make a lot of money, and very little of it actually gets into the hands of solving the problem. So I come at it from a market orientation. We need to free the market to do what it does best, which is build housing or produce things. That's what markets do. And so our solution, based on looking at literally over a dozen case studies across the country, and we're just getting ready to release one on Utah, shows that if you have Byright zoning, meaning no discretion on the part of the zoning board or the city council, whatever, for higher density, and we'll talk about the types of higher density during the course of this podcast, and you follow what we call the keep it short and simple, or KISS rule, you will unleash a swarm of housing construction by largely small developers and medium-sized developers. It will just unleash a swarm of housing development. Why? Because the market abhors a vacuum. And what has happened, as soon as you allow that to happen, the market senses that vacuum and that opportunity and races in to fill it.
Ed, some of the things you mentioned, I want to talk first about Byright zoning and ask you to expand on that a little bit. And our listeners may remember in previous episodes on this topic, I've shared some of my experiences. I used to work for the Salt Lake County Council as a policy advisor. So we, of course, dealt with some of these issues from a housing and planning standpoint. And so I've seen kind of, the presentations that planning commission folks would come and give to municipal councils when they are being asked whether to approve or deny a particular development request. But so can you kind of educate our listeners on what do you mean by Byright zoning? How would that be different than what the status quo is right now?
So the status quo would be called discretionary zoning, which is you can build at the discretion of the zoning commission or the city council. You have to get their approval to do, A, B, or C. That discretion, of course, leads to a lot of involvement by government officials. It leads to a lot of lobbying. It leads to a lot of political contributions. And it leads to public hearings because you have to make a decision that involves discretion. Byright says, wait a minute, you can build this by right, no discretion involved from the government. And the experience I had in stumbling on this was I grew up in a town called Palisades Park, New Jersey, which is a small town about a mile from the George Washington Bridge across from Manhattan. And I grew up there in the 50s and early 60s. And I went back there decades later, and I happened to look in Wikipedia one day, and I noticed the population of Palisades Park had changed from 12,000 to 21,000. And I go, well, that's interesting. It looks kind of the same. There are no high-rise buildings. It was completely built up. It was so close to New York City back in the 50s and 60s. There wasn't vacant land to speak of. How did this population go up? And it took me a while to find the answer. And the answer was quite simple. Palisades Park, when they implemented its zoning ordinance in 1939, said you can build 1 or 2 homes on any residential parcel. Your choice, no discretion with the municipality. It was by right. Well, initially, the vast majority of homes that got built were one family because that's where the demand was, and that was economically feasible to do that. But over time, as land prices went up and got more expensive, remember, this is a mile from Manhattan. As that happened, it became economically viable to tear down 50 and 60-year-old homes and replace them with a 2-family duplex, side-by-side duplex. That was a higher and better use. But no, there was no discretion on the part of the municipality as to doing that building. And so it just happened naturally. Over 30 years, 60% of the single-family detached homes in Palisades Park converted to these duplexes, and that's what allowed the population to go up. A very small thing, but at the same time, it had a huge impact. One other thing is the keep it simple and short and simple rule, KISS. There's a town called Richfield Park, right next to Palisades Park, that also is zoned almost entirely for 1 or 2 family, except they have a poison pill in their ordinance. It says if you want to build a 2-family, you need twice as much land. Well, that undoes the entire purpose of building 2 homes on a lot. You now need to get 2 lots. Well, now it's not economically viable to do that. So that's why the KISS rule is so important.
So let me ask you this. How does this idea of Byright zoning, how does that balance in your mind with the principle of local control? And here in Utah, that, of course, is mentioned often. There's sort of a strong, I would say, culture of wanting to value the local control, the ability of city leaders to have a significant role sort of charting the destiny for their communities. And so what if there is a Byright zoning approach, what then becomes the role of a municipal planning commission or city council in sort of guiding the character and growth of their community over time?
Nic, let me turn the question around. What gives local communities the right to control property the way they control it? So the Utah Constitution, in its Bill of Rights, has Declaration of Rights, inherent and inalienable rights. All persons shall have the inherent and inalienable right to acquire, possess, and protect property. Now, if you want to build an ADU in Utah. Can you do it without getting permission from a bunch of bureaucrats? No. You want to build a duplex. You want to build two townhouses where there is a single family. Can you do it? No. You need permission. You need to go through all kinds of bureaucratic process. Wait a minute. What gives the locality the right to do that? Because the Constitution places that with the persons who live in Utah. Secondly, there's a provision that says the provisions of this Constitution are mandatory and prohibitory unless by express words they are decided to be otherwise. So wait a minute, if you want to impinge on the right to own property, you have to have a darn good reason other than just whim. And again, it is pure whim to say you can't build an ADU or a duplex. Lastly, there's a third provision that says frequent recurrence to fundamental principles is essential to the security of individual rights and the perpetuating free government. That means we don't care that you've been doing it this way for 100 years. If it violates these inherent and inalienable rights, you have to change them. And so we're trying to change the discussion. We've gone through all 50 state constitutions, and we found that 25 of them had pretty strong provisions like Utah's on property rights. 12 of those 25 had this recursion language it's recurrence language, which actually dates back to 3 founding fathers, George Mason, Ben Franklin, and John Adams. They all talked about this in George Mason in the Virginia Bill of Rights, Ben Franklin in the Pennsylvania Bill of Rights, and George Mason and John Adams in the Massachusetts Bill of Rights, 1776, 1776, 1780. So this is a concept that goes back to the founding of our country.
Ed, do you see any sort of, I guess, what's the limiting principle on that idea? And part of my context for this question, actually, one of our previous episodes, we brought on an individual named Nolan Gray with an organization called YIMBY, based out of California, and he had actually been on part of a planning commission in a previous role in New York, and now is working on housing policy, and he talked a lot about kind of this idea of, I think he even you use terms like ending zoning or abolishing zoning. But one of my questions to him that I kind of ask the same question to you is, there's, we often think, or our minds naturally go to the extremes of, well, either I can build literally anything on my property. I could, put a really loud, smelly factory in my backyard right next to someone else's house or an elementary school. I think that's not the kind of thing people are talking about. And then on the other end of the spectrum, if you feel like you can't do anything with your property without getting government permission the ways you're talking about. So I think there's got to be some way of sort of having a reasonable approach where there are guiding principles that avoid the extremes, but still allow people to be innovative, as you said, with ADUs and those kinds of things that can be a solution. So how would you articulate the right way to sort of craft, okay, here's the guiding principle framework for when it comes to local zoning, and how do we, again, allow the kind of housing innovation we need, but in a way that's not going to freak people out, that it's going to go too far, if that makes sense?
So again, I think you have to start with property rights and what's an appropriate infringement on property rights. One appropriate infringement is to say you can't have a nuisance. You can't put a smelly factory up in a residential area or a polluting factory in a residential area. Secondly, you have health and safety. You have to meet health and safety requirements. But wait a minute, if you have a health and safety requirement that's a certain standard for single family detached, what allows you to have a higher standard for a duplex or an ADU? And so that it becomes, when we roll back to how did zoning get entrenched in the United States, it actually got entrenched starting in 1922, and the godfather of that was Herbert Hoover, who was the Commerce Secretary in 1922, and he appointed a commission to look at zoning enabling laws at the state level. And if the old saw that if you the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you put a bunch of planners on a commission, they're going to come back and say you have to have zoning, and that's exactly what they did. But they had a nefarious under purpose for it. The Supreme Court in 1916 had said you can't use zoning to keep blacks, and blacks in particular, out of a neighborhood. And so they were looking for a way to do that, and also to keep ethnic minorities from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe out of neighborhoods which were being built during the, quote, roaring 20s. And the answer they came up with was economic zoning. If we make housing just enough more expensive, then these individuals we don't want in our neighborhoods won't be able to afford it. Well, they succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. They didn't have to increase the price of housing by much. They just knew they had to increase it by a little bit. How did they do that? Well, single family detached, side yards, front yards, backyards, minimum lot size, minimum home size. You start putting these requirements in, and all of a sudden the house costs more. They knew back then that if you built a townhome, it was going to sell for less. Less land, less size. If you built a triple decker, a 3-story, like was common in New England, that was going to sell for less. If you built a duplex, a triplex, all those things were going to sell for less. They outlawed all of those, and they threw them into the multifamily bucket. They said, oh, a duplex is multifamily, just like a 20-story apartment building. They put them into the same category. That was completely unnecessary, but it was required in order to accomplish this nefarious goal of keeping blacks and minorities out, and ethnic minorities out of these areas.
Ed, we got a few minutes before we need to go to a break, but I want to ask you about a couple of other variables that often come up in this topic. You've talked about zoning for a while. Related to that is sort of the land constraint, or the supply of land. And especially here in Utah, we're a little bit unique in that we are a very mountainous state, and the Wasatch Front, Salt Lake City area, north and south, for those who don't live here, is a very urbanized area, and we're kind of, again, right on the cusp of this massive mountain range that is the Wasatch Front. Salt Lake City sits in a big valley called Salt Lake Valley, and there's mountains on the other side, and you have the Great Salt Lake northwest of Salt Lake Valley. And so essentially our major urban areas are sandwiched between multiple mountain ranges. So there's already some geographic constraint on land supply, but also now this concept of, well, to what extent is local zoning creating an additional constraint at times on land supply because of the kind of things you're talking about, just the way they zone for certain lot sizes and things like that. Folks here in Utah who are looking at ways to improve the housing supply, how should we be looking at zoning? What should we be talking about in terms of reforms? Because how much weight do you place on that specifically as a key variable impacting housing costs?
Let me, spoiler alert, that would solve the entire problem, and I'll demonstrate that. So let me start by saying Utah is in a really bad position from a housing affordability perspective. It has fantastic job growth. When you have job growth, you need more housing. It builds a lot of housing. Utah builds a lot of housing, but it's not keeping up with its job growth. It's the fastest state in the country in terms of job growth over the last 20, 25 years. That's issue number one. Issue number two, and this may shock your audience, when we look at all 50 states and we apply what we call our carpenter index, carpenters can build housing, can they afford one? And we say, well, can a carpenter household afford the entry-level house in the metro that they're building, that they live in? And the answer is, back in 2012, it was pretty easy to do that in a lot of the country, except in pockets in California, Hawaii. But Utah was not the best back then, but it was a lot better than it is today. Flash forward to 2023, the last year that we have data. Utah, by that metric, is worse than California. Only 11% of Utah carpenter households, as we measure them, would be able to afford the median-priced entry-level home. That's lower than California. I think California's at 16 or 17%. So that tells you how bad it is in California. So now let's go through a couple of thought experiments. You mentioned land. And I believe there's an effort underway by the state of Utah to focus on the fact that the federal government owns, I believe, 70% of the land in Utah. I think it's second to Nevada. Secondly, if I'm remembering the advertising correctly, half of those, that acreage is what I call Smokey the Bear, national parks, national monuments, forests, et cetera, et cetera. The other half, or 35% of the state, is basically with the Bureau of Land Management, spread all over the state, but it's 35% of the state. Well, the state has 85,000 square miles. So 35% of 85,000 square miles is what? 30,000 square miles. So now let's talk about how much land it would take to build 300,000 homes. Well, if you were to build at about 12 homes per acre, there are about 500 buildable acres in a square mile. So that's about 6,000 homes per square mile. You multiply that by 100 square miles, and you could build 600,000 homes on that land. Now, people say, well, the land is in the right spot, and it doesn't have this and doesn't have that, and it's sprawl. I would challenge anyone to prove that there isn't 100 square miles out of 35,000 square miles that could be used properly and without lots of sprawl and other things and efficiently for housing. That's 0.3% of what the federal government owns in terms of the Bureau of Land Management. That's number one as a thought experiment. Number two is a thought experiment. Utah, from 2000 to 2024, built 232,000 new single-family detached homes. They were on average, quarter-acre parcels. So you had 4 homes to an acre. Those homes today would sell for, we know what they sell for today using automated valuation models, $710,000, which is pretty expensive. They had 2,200 square feet. About over 90% of them, 93% of them were owner occupied. Very important statistic because of Utah's desire to promote owner occupancy and wealth building. If you were to increase from 4 homes per acre, again, starting in 2000, and instead of building at 4, you built at 6.5. And I would challenge virtually anyone to tell the difference in a subdivision between one on 4 homes per acre and one on 6.5. They look pretty much the same, except that instead of 232,000 homes, you'd get 377,000 homes. And instead of selling for $710,000, they'd sell for $630,000. Not a huge difference, but 10% lower. But you'd end up with a lot more homes, and they'd be, instead of 2,200 square feet, they'd be 1,940 square feet, still very much family-sized homes. And the same 93% would be owner-occupied. But let's make one other change. Let's say that 20% of the acreage for those 332,000 homes, you didn't build single-family detached on them, you built single-family attached or townhomes. Townhomes in Utah get built 35 to an acre. If you were to make that change, instead of getting 232,000 homes over this 24-year period, you'd have gotten 632,000 homes, an extra 400,000 homes. We would not be having this conversation today, Nick, if that path had been taken in 2000. And those homes would sell for $602,000, which is below the median of the existing housing stock in Utah. They'd have 1,950 square feet, and you'd have about 89% of them would be owner-occupied. So all of the problems that Utah is facing today would have been solved. So then you might ask, well, what's the difference? That's the past. Well, there's a saying that says, the best time to plant an oak tree is 20 years ago. When's the second best time? Today. So Utah today could decide going forward to go with this, what we call light touch density, which is a combination of smaller lots, not hugely different, go from 4 to 6.5 on average, and then increase the amount of townhomes, which is another type of light touch density. I look back in 1940s, 1 out of 6 households in Utah lived in either 2 to 4 home structures or townhomes. That was normal back then. We need to return back to that type of topology of homes.
Ed, before we go to break, can you expand a little bit? Light touch density. What do you mean by that?
So density can range from, and you mentioned it, from single family detached on 1 acre, to single family detached on 4,000 square feet, a tenth of an acre roughly, all the way to a 300 unit apartment building. And the key with 300 unit apartment buildings, or even apartment buildings or even buildings over 20 units, just 20 units, the percentage of owner occupants in those buildings that are built in Utah is 3%. 3%. The percentage for single family detached in Utah is 93%, and the percentage for townhomes is 69%. So you see what happens if you want to promote home ownership. You need to promote what I call light touch density. So what's light touch density? Light touch density says build single family detached on smaller lots, number one. Number two, allow duplexes, triplexes, quadruplexes, even 5 and 6. If you're in an amenity-rich area, allow even somewhat larger. Allow townhomes. You could build on a quarter-acre lot, which is about 11,000 square feet. You can easily build 4 or 5 or 6 townhomes on those. You could allow lot splits. There's all kinds. You can allow ADUs. There's all kinds of things that could be done, and that's light touch density. Higher density would be things that are larger apartment buildings, more than 8 units or more, high-rise buildings, mid-rise buildings. But townhomes, in a townhome development or building, 8 or 10 in a row, that's light touch density. There's another benefit to light touch density as I'm describing it under the building code that's used virtually throughout the United States. There's a residential building code, and there's what is called a commercial residential building code. The residential building code says if you're building 1 or 2 homes in a structure, you get to use the residential building code. But if you're building townhomes, you also get to use the residential building code. But if you're going more than 2 units in a structure, you have to follow the commercial residential building code. And as you move up to larger and larger buildings, you end up driving the price up. So the way that Utah can solve this problem is a combination of smaller lots. Utah builds a lot of homes. Over the last 5 years, Utah built an average of 20,000 homes a year. You can just imagine, as our numbers show, that if you were to do this light touch density lot scenario, you can go from 20,000 per year to 40,000 on the exact same amount of land. Again, you would be promoting home ownership because, as I said, 89% of these homes would be owner occupied.
Well, Ed, let's take a quick break. When we come back, I do want to ask you about some of your recent writings responding to a proposal from Vice President Harris that you think is actually headed in the wrong direction. So we'll get into that right after this break. We're talking with Ed Pinto from the American Enterprise Institute and co-director of AEI's Housing Center. This is Defending Ideas. Stick around.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn, and we're going to continue our conversation with Ed Pinto from the American Enterprise Institute, where he is co-director of the Housing Center. We've been talking about housing prices and how to bring them down here in Utah. What can we do from a policy standpoint to address the housing crisis here in the Beehive State? Before we jump back in, though, I want to remind you, if you enjoy what you're hearing today, please visit defendingideas.org. There you can find access to this as well as previous full conversations, episodes on a wide range of topics. You can also access short clips that you can share on your own social media channels. And make sure you subscribe to Defending Ideas on all of the major podcast platforms like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, really just wherever you like to listen to your shows. Search for Defending Ideas and click subscribe. If you prefer to watch, make sure you subscribe to the Sutherland Institute YouTube channel. And if you are watching, click the little bell icon in the corner so you get notified each time a new episode drops, which is every Tuesday morning. Again, all that and more at defendingideas.org. Ed, I want to continue because you have been offering some commentary to respond to some of the things going on at the national level, some of the proposals that folks might be hearing about. In particular, you wrote an article recently with co-author Tobias Peter that appeared on the AEI website. It links to a Newsweek piece as well. I want to read a quick excerpt of what's there and ask you to expand on it. We'll include the link in the show notes for our listeners and viewers, of course, so you can go read it as well. But you and Tobias write, in response to this plan, which is, quote, offering $25,000 in down payment assistance to 4 million first-time home buyers over 4 years at a significant cost of $100 billion to taxpayers. However, the AEI Housing Center estimates that even without Harris's proposal, 3 million of these recipients would have been able to purchase homes on their own, thus giving a substantial boost in purchasing power in an already supply-constrained market. You go on to say, additionally, the subsidy could pull forward new demand from an additional 1 million buyers, further exacerbating price inflation. Ed, can you expand on that a little bit? I'm sure there's folks out there that are thinking, well, if houses are expensive, let's just give folks a little bit of money so it's a little easier for them to buy a home. It's kind of a natural place to go mentally, but based on what you wrote, can you expand on why is that a bad idea?
Let me start with the title of that op-ed, which was Vice President Harris's plan is worse than doing nothing. And the reason it's worse than doing nothing is it goes back to Economics 101. Economics 101 says if you have a constrained supply and you increase demand, the only thing that can change up is price. And so we actually, I had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a couple weeks after that Newsweek op-ed where we had quantified the impact of this. And I need to talk a little bit about why the impact is so broad, because what we found was that these 3 million existing, first-time buyers that were already going to be in the market, plus another million extra, as talked about by Vice President Harris. How can that affect the market so much? And the reason is that a market is basically an auction, and you have to think of it on a neighborhood level. You're in a neighborhood, and if somebody in that neighborhood has more money, the government gives them more money, they have more buying power. Well, if it's only one person and there are 100 buyers, it doesn't have much impact. But let's assume it's 30 people out of those 100. Well, at some point, and we can calculate what that point is, you end up having the ability to set the price. Your extra buying power allows you to come out on top. Well, your competition has to either match what you're doing or drop out. Some people will match, some people will drop out. But it raises the price for everybody in that neighborhood, ultimately. And what we found was that this would impact home sales in 75% of all of the transactions across the country. 75%. And it would raise prices in those census tracts, that's how we were tracking it, by 4.1% initially, just a 4.1% increase. When you multiply that out, that was $175 billion of price increases for which the government doled out $100 billion of subsidy. Not very efficient. But it even gets worse when you calculate what the impact is on the remaining stock of houses in those census tracts, those neighborhoods. It's $1 trillion increase in houses. Well, how can that be? Well, the country has around $35 trillion of housing total value, single-family homes. You multiply by that 75%, you get something a little under $30 trillion. You multiply that by 4%, and you get a number that approaches around $1 trillion. And because these are huge numbers, and the government is moving the market with this massive number of 4 million people. So That is why this is worse than doing nothing. The only way it could possibly work is if we had a surplus of housing. Well, we are very far away from a surplus of housing, number one. And number two, then you get into the problem of one size fits all. I was just looking at months inventory numbers across the country today. And yes, there's places that are down at 1.8 months inventory, which is an extremely tight seller's market. There are places at 8 months inventory, which is just the beginning of a buyer's market. But across the country, you have a huge variation. The federal government can't figure that out. It's incapable. Only markets can figure that out. Government programs can't figure it out. So the government comes up with a one size fits all, and they're going to throw money in Grand Rapids and Pittsburgh at the same level as they're going to throw in Dallas or Salt Lake City.
So Ed, this resonates with me in a lot of ways because I think there's an application, and I think you may have mentioned it's kind of economics 101, but an application to other policy areas as well, where I see very often, whether we're talking about the cost of childcare, the cost of healthcare, the cost of education, specifically higher ed, any of those kinds of things, again, and now in the context of housing, there's this instinct to simply subsidize the people who are purchasing the good or service, but that doesn't actually do anything to bring down the cost. And I would distinguish it between the cost of something and the price of something. If you subsidize the buyer, you reduce the price for them a little bit, but it doesn't actually affect the cost of the underlying item. And again, we've seen some of these things proposed in, again, the childcare subsidy world and other spaces. But what I think is refreshing and important about what you're saying is it's saying, look, there's a whole wealth of reasons why subsidizing the demand for this is not the right way to go. But then pivoting back to this idea of, well, then it really does come back to supply. What are the levers we can pull to increase supply? And you also talk a lot about saying, well, yes, we need to increase supply, but not through government subsidies on the supply side either. So can you talk about that a little bit? If we're saying, yes, let's focus on supply, but no, we still don't want to bring government subsidies into the supply side, why do you think that is?
So let me go back to one of my favorite economists, a French economist, Frédéric Bastiat. And he was a legislator, a House of Deputies, I guess it was called back in the 1840s. But he also was an economist. And he came up with the broken window theory, which the simple way of looking at, a window breaks. You just added to GDP because you have to replace the window. Well, wait a minute. If you hadn't broken that window, you would have used that money for something productive. Replacing the window isn't productive, except it's necessary. So he observed the difference between a bad economist and a good economist. A bad economist looks at the scene. And so that was what's going on with Vice President Harris's proposal. The scene is 4 million first-time buyers are getting $25,000 apiece. But he said you have to look at the unseen and the foreseeable. Well, the unseen is that's going to drive up prices for everybody that's in that market. And it's foreseeable that that's going to just end up making it more expensive, and it's going to cost much more than the money you're spending. It's going to have the unintended consequences that we always end up with, largely with government programs. So back to the solution, when you look at government subsidy solutions, and government subsidies suffer from what I call the 5 C's. The first is complexity. Any government subsidy, it's complexity. It's cost. It's costly to comply with government requirements. Corruption. It breeds corruption both by the recipients and the people that are using the programs, as this happens in healthcare all the time. There was just an article in the Wall Street Journal about you send a nurse out to someone's home, and all of a sudden there's an extra $1,200 of care that somebody's going to get reimbursed on in a Medicare Advantage program. And so there's corruption. There's crowding out. It crowds out the market participants because they're not benefiting from this, and they're being, it's a competition. And you have a cartel. People who like subsidies end up being in a clique or cartel because they end up lobbying for these subsidies. The 90% of the people that aren't in the cartel end up not caring as much about it, but the lobby group really cares about that subsidy. You can look at student loans, you can look at housing, all of those things. So that all ends up being top-down government picking winners and losers. The government is very poor at picking winners. They're very good at picking losers. So the approach that we have is to say, okay, here are 4 steps that Utah can take. The first is light touch density greenfield subdivisions. I've already talked about that. If you were to just increase the density from around 4 per acre to 6.5 for single family detached, and then you have more single family attached, that 20% of the acreage, you would get tons and tons more housing. Doesn't cost a penny to do that. Not a penny in government subsidies. And the tax revenue per acre goes up dramatically, and the municipalities have more money to pay for whatever they need. But the infrastructure also doesn't go up proportionally because you're not using any more land. You don't have to build more roads to get to it, whatever. Secondly, was what we call light touch density infill with tear down. As land prices go up, and they've gone up a lot in Utah, if you make it so you can't build a parcel of land to a higher and better use, what a parcel of land is worth under valuation theory is its highest and best use that's legal. And so let me give you the 2 opposite extremes. The only thing you can build on a parcel is a single family detached home. The land price has gone up dramatically. The structure value hasn't changed much. It's a depreciating asset. It was built 60 years ago or 50 years ago. It's not worth a lot today, but the land is worth a tremendous amount. Your highest and best use for that parcel, if the only use it can be put to is single family detached, is to tear it down and build what we call a McMansion. So you replace, in Utah's case, a $600,000 parcel that has a house that's basically a tear down on it, and you replace it with the house that costs 3 times as much and has about 3 times the square footage. That's the only way to get the land share back down to an economically viable number. But if, on the other hand, you were to allow, let's assume it's a 10,000 square foot parcel, you were to allow townhouses to be built on that parcel, you could build, say, 5 townhouses. Well, those townhouses wouldn't sell, in the aggregate would sell for maybe 4 times what the teardown was, but each one would sell for less than the teardown. Well, now what you've done is you've reduced the cost of the additional house that's added by adding 5 houses rather than 1. So you've increased the supply, and the houses that you've added are going to sell for less than the house that you tore down. Well, that's where you want to be in terms of addressing supply problems. The third thing is you could do what we call light touch density infill without a tear down. So where the economics don't support tearing down, or it isn't possible to tear down, you could potentially add an accessory dwelling unit. Or you could split a lot and keep the structure on the one lot and build another structure on the other lot. Or our fourth example is what we call livable urban villages. And this is going on in Utah, both in urban areas that have commercial amenities. They're adding residential properties, high-rise buildings, mid-rise buildings, to those areas, which are increasing the amenities, which are making them more desirable. Well, there's an adjacent area around those areas that are conducive to this infill light touch density, but the core area itself could be expanded with these residential overlays that are currently limited to commercial and industrial use. So there's the Holiday shopping mall down in Holiday that has been in litigation since, I think, 2006, where they couldn't get agreement to do anything with it. It's now been torn down, and it's being turned into a mixed-use area that's largely going to be residential with some commercial. That is going to be a big net increase. It had no residential before, so it may have 500 homes now. When it gets built out. Well, you've now added 500 homes. So when you add all this up, we think you could add 20,000 homes per year with the light touch density greenfield. You could add 11,000 homes per year with the light touch density infill with teardown. You can add 6,000 ADUs and the lot split a year without a teardown with light touch density. And the livable urban villages, we think you could add another 1,000 per year. You add all that up and it's 32,000 homes per year, which is an increase of 160% over the current 20,000 that are being built per year. That would, over 10 years, completely solve Utah's housing crisis and foster housing's economic family miracle that it wants to promote.
Well, Ed, we're a little over time, but that was amazing, especially that final kind of conceptualization of 4 key steps for folks here in Utah. We'll have to have you back because there's a lot more to talk about here. But I just want to ask, with kind of those 4 steps you just outlined, and again, that very compelling 32,000 additional homes per year could be built in Utah based on the model you just outlined. If my elevator question to kind of round out the episode, if you step into an elevator and you see Utah's governor and legislative leadership standing there, they say, "Hey, you're Ed Pinto. You're the AEI housing expert. We heard the detail about those 4 steps that you just talked about. We've got a few seconds. What's the first thing we should do? Just tell us what's the first step Utah should take to move in that direction."
Step 1 is stop making plans and data, trying to get data. Second, get out of the way. The success sequence is very simple. Byright zoning, however you want to define it, just allow more density. You can choose what you want. You can limit it to 2-family homes and duplexes. You can limit it to small lots and duplexes for single-family detached. Whatever. Make a decision. We can tell you how many homes we think will get built by those choices, as I just went through. Those changes I mentioned are pretty modest. The only one that involves any kind of significant density is the core area, which already has large buildings in it. And so you're putting larger buildings in areas with large buildings. So that's the answer. Get out of the way. Don't subsidize it. Just let the private sector do what it does best, which is fill the needs of human beings.
Final question, Ed. Is there any role for the federal government on this issue? And if so, what should it be?
There's not much role. I've been involved in this area for 50 years. I started out in affordable housing with the Michigan State Housing Development Authority, and I've studied the federal efforts, and they just can't get it right for many of the reasons I've mentioned. There is one federal role, and I've already mentioned it, alluded to it, which is federal government owns 70% of Utah. They could find 100 square miles of Utah, and that would allow something like 600,000 homes to be built. 50 square miles gives you 300,000 homes. We have a precedent for this. I mentioned that Nevada has even a higher percentage than Utah. Senator Reed, who was the majority leader decades ago, up until 10 or 12 years ago, I don't remember exactly when, he got bills passed through Congress on a number of occasions that allowed the federal government to auction off land in the Las Vegas area. And tens and tens of thousands of homes. They're still using that land, but they've almost run out. I actually met with a builder this morning, and he said, "Oh yes, I'm working with another builder. He has 3,000 acres that he just got from the federal release of land in Las Vegas, but they've just about run out and they need more."
Well, Ed, we will leave it there. I so appreciate your time and your expertise and bringing your years and years of experience and expertise on this issue to the state of Utah to help us figure this out, because this is an incredibly essential issue for us to figure out in Utah, as you said, so that the economic miracle, the strong families, having this be a place that people can continue to live and work and raise their families, that's important to all of us here in Utah. So again, thank you for lending your experience and expertise and your time helping us move this issue forward here in Utah. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Nick. Always a pleasure. Happy to come back.
Well, we're going to take one more final break before we leave you with some talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before we go, I want to emphasize a few key principles from our discussion with Ed that I think can formulate our talking points on this issue if you and I get into a discussion about this with people in our networks or circles. Number one, we need to leverage the free enterprise system to fix the housing crisis, more so than relying on government spending or programs to do it. And in Ed's words, that means getting out of the way. The private sector is really good at creating things, in this case, houses. Number two, subsidizing demand, as some proposals would do by simply giving money to people to help them buy a home, doesn't actually address the underlying cost of a home. And in fact, by increasing demand in that way, it can actually make the problem worse. This is a problem that is best solved at the state and local level. The federal government may have a role in some areas, one example of which is the federal lands issue that Ed mentioned. But in general, we should look first to our local mayors and city council members, legislators, and governor to craft policy solutions to the housing crisis. Well, that's it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed this discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. Don't forget to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you like to get your shows. And please share this episode on your own social media profiles or with a friend, family member, or coworker who you think may find it interesting. And lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us on Defending Ideas. From the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City, I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.